Hi, George Haas here. I wanted to elaborate a little bit on what we started last week, which is the meditation interventions for addiction process, focusing on the first module, which is called Craving and Urge. Understanding that addiction and the system of addiction that people use, mostly substances and processes, so it's useful to have a complete picture of what the addiction cycle is, how the use of substances and processes are integrated, each person arriving at their own combination of those. But understanding that that whole process is a means of emotional regulation so that you develop a way of being in the world, a way of regulating emotions. I think it's also important to understand that we don't really have a choice about regulating emotions. We only have a choice about how we do it. In some sense, we're conditioned to regulate our emotion. And when I say we have a choice about how we do it, we can condition the body-mind to regulate emotions in a different way than we're currently doing it. So that if you're using addiction to substances or processes as a way of regulating your emotion, you can change the way that you regulate emotion. But that's a conditioning process, a reconditioning process. I think that it's also important to understand that addiction is a decision that people have made not to rely on other people as a way of regulating emotion. If you look at the nature of the human condition and how we are set up, co-regulation with another human being is the gold standard, really, for how one would regulate emotion. That is to say, you attune to somebody, you allow an empathetic connection to form between the two of you, and the person holding the compassionate embrace brings their emotional regulation skills to the suffering of the other person and helps bring them back into balance. It's pretty ordinary to go out into life and in our exploration get knocked sideways emotionally and not be able to right ourselves, even if we're really good at emotional regulation. If we were conditioned in early childhood to see other people as a means of emotional regulation, then when we are dysregulated and can't bring ourselves back into balance, we would naturally turn to other people to help us. But people who use addictive strategies tend to find through their early conditioning, their early relationships, that other people weren't reliable enough to count on for that. And so they developed a system of emotional regulation where they don't have to rely on other people. So perhaps the first decision to make is that other people can be reliable enough to count on, going counter to the conditioning of early childhood. In the first module, Craving and Urge, we look at the way that the body-mind is currently set up to emotionally regulate. So understand that you have an ordinary bandwidth, let's say, of emotion that you can just be with without needing an external source of regulation. But if something happens in the present moment and we respond with a strong emotional experience, an emotional event that exceeds the normal bandwidth can form, and then that's what needs to be regulated by additional strategies. In Craving and Urge, craving refers to the automatic response to an emotional event that we would normally regulate with using. So something happens in the present moment, it creates an emotional response that exceeds the normal bandwidth of experience, which is something that needs to be regulated. And then the mind thinks of using because that's how we're currently set up to regulate that kind of experience. The thought of using that's spontaneous, that is to say automatic in response to an emotional event that needs regulation, is deeply conditioned and takes a while to change. So a lot of practice to change it. These are not decisions that we make, but these are conditioned response. So we're talking about a procedural memory response rather than a chronological or autobiographical memory response. If you allow the mind to engage in the thought process of using as a way of self-soothing, even though you may not intend to use, uh, then the mind creates the thought, which then creates a feeling response in the body that's helpful in regulating the experience of the present moment.
We're back.
So craving is the automatic response of I'm thinking of using because there's an emotional situation in the present moment that needs regulating, and urging is the allowing the mind the thought process of using. The thought process itself is what's regulating. We think of something, and in the thought itself there's the visual aspect, the auditory aspect, and also the emotional aspect in the body. The present moment reaction plays out on the surface face, front of the throat, front of the torso, inside of the arms and inside of the legs here. And the self-generated emotion plays in the same arena, so that you can have a thought process that generates an intense emotion that then displaces awareness of the experience of the present moment. If there were no harm in allowing this self-soothing process of using to play, then it would be something to consider as a strategy for emotional regulation. But typically speaking, when something exceeds the normal bandwidth, that there's a stressor in the present moment that does that, without attending to the conditions of the present moment and alleviating the circumstances of the stressor tends to intensify. What you may notice is that the higher level of stress, the more your cognitive ability diminishes, and you'll reach a certain point where the cognitive ability to tell the difference between a self-soothing fantasy and an actual plan of action is lost, and you may find that you just use or lapse. I think it's important to make a distinction between a lapse and a relapse, a lapse being a single incident of falling back into the addictive behavior, say a single use of a substance. Relapse would be where you've returned to the same level of use that you had before you tried to stop last time. So allowing the mind to urge in some ways sets up the conditions where, if the stress continues to accelerate and at a certain point your cognitive ability to distinguish between a self-soothing strategy and actual plan of action is lost, you find yourself using. This opens you to the abstinence violation effect. In some sense, when you use, the use of the addictive substance or strategy relieves the experience of stress, the cognitive ability of the mind returns, and then you realize that you've had a lapse. And typically there's a strong emotional response that comes from lapsing guilt, shame, regret, remorse, one of those. And so in addition to the conditions of the present moment that were already causing an emotional response that needed to be regulated, we heap on top of that shame or guilt from the lapse, which is another strong emotion that needs to be regulated, and that amps up the cycle of distress in the present moment and the need to regulate. And often the lapse is met with the impulse or the desire to use again. So craving returns, and if we don't interrupt the cycle of urging, then we're back to planning the next use. And if the stress continues to amplify, we again lose the ability to distinguish between what is the self-soothing fantasy and what is an actual plan of action, and we may lapse again, which then heaps on the next layer of strong emotion that needs to be regulated and spin in this way into actually relapsing. So in the first module, Craving and Urge, we learn to monitor the thinking process so that we can pay attention to when the mind is craving use, and also when the mind is urging or fantasizing about using, and through meditation learn to suppress the urge and replace it either with a metta practice or a Vipassana practice, notably the noting feeling states technique, I find really useful for that. So that's Module 1. Next time we'll talk about Module 2, Stress, Anger, and Depression. Thanks.